Anyone see that okay? Yeah. Blurred, I guess. Okay, well, hello everyone. In this short paper presentation, which is based on a much longer and more comprehensive work, I want to simply introduce you to a classic perplexity, what the ancient Greeks referred to as aporia, regarding the most fundamental, needful thing that should be at the heart of all that we do as educators, namely wisdom. At this conference, there are so many excellent teachers and academic researchers in the field of assessment. Their work is replete with thoughtful analysis, designed to offer us a multitude of ways to improve both our formative and summative practices. However, let us suppose for a moment that by adopting the most excellent and well-researched assessment practices, we find ourselves better able to produce students with better grades, higher intelligence quotients, improved critical analytic thought processes, enhanced communication and collaborative skills, heightened creativity and innovative capacities, as well as student graduates who will be more successful in their future endeavors as competitors in a global economy. Such improvements do not seem to be outside of the realm of possibility. But even if we're able to produce such wonderful feats of educational achievement in our classrooms, we must still wrestle with the plain fact that, having done so, we remain no further ahead with regard to wisdom or happiness. The psychologist Robert Sternberg put this quandary most succinctly some 10 years ago when he wrote, "Human intelligence has to some extent brought the world to the brink. Intelligence has brought us many good things, but also has brought us nuclear weapons that have the power to destroy the world several times over, as well as the addictive designer drugs that are destroying the lives of millions of people, young and old, around the world. Human intelligence has brought us to where we are. Human intelligence combined with creativity and practical intelligence may have brought us the disaster at the World Trade Center that took place September 11. The plan was creative in its own way. It was analytically brilliant, evading the defenses of a nation, and it was practically shrewd, inflicting maximum damage for the number of people who were needed to carry it out. The plan was not, for whatever else it may have been, wise. And the people who hatched it weren't wise either. So it may take wisdom to help us find a way out of that trap of our own making," unquote. Oops, I think I went to, there we go. What we lack in pursuing, I think I should just leave that, What we lack in pursuing wisdom is that one good thing by which all other goods might be appropriately understood and enjoyed. Without wisdom, our critical analytic judgments and calculations very easily derail, becoming only efficient means toward the gratification of our diverse desires. Any creativity unleashed by our innovative spirit might simply enable us to develop ever new and more harmful ways of wreaking our ignorance upon the world and each other. And although cooperative learning and cultivating the ability to work harmoniously with others are noteworthy components of education, skillful collaborations that preserve a modicum of peace between associates are needed, as St. Augustine noted long ago, even among bands of thieves. So too might the enhancement of our communication skills lend itself to little more than the adept rationalization of our selfish interests, or to more persuasive demagoguery. Easiest to see, perhaps, is how the logic of successful global competitiveness in the creation of winners and losers does nothing to contribute to the peace and happiness of the vast majority of people on earth. Such logic can only, in the end, fold in upon itself destructively with terrible suffering consequences. What is lacking in our current day educational understanding is any enticement towards wisdom. Certainly we seek eagerly after all the secondary goods just mentioned, And as educators, we've taken up the great social responsibility of ensuring that our students find themselves able to achieve all these prescribed outcomes of learning. However, in doing so, we've also failed to see that without this one primary good and wisdom, our ability to enjoy and to appreciate the goodness of all the secondary ones is greatly jeopardized. In education, our fixation with assessment has a strong tendency to divert both us as teachers as well as our students from the sort of learning that is associated with wisdom's pursuit. So, for the next little while, I simply want to explore with you just a few of the confounding statements that have been made by some of the world's ancient and medieval writers about why it is the case that assessment and wisdom seeking do not mix. So the first one. First, we need to understand that there is no measure for wisdom. Discussions about wisdom that are grounded in ancient insights involve certain difficult problems for modern-day teacher assessors. Right? Teachers who are assessors, not people who assess teachers. Although that probably too. In our daily classroom assessments, for instance, we make judgments about the adeptness and proficiency, the correctness, the depth and the breadth of our students' knowledge and their skills and their attitudes, all using all sorts of rich formative and summative procedures and tools. However, wisdom cannot likewise be assessed. For whereas each art and science judges matters within its own discipline, wisdom enables human beings to make judgments about each of the arts and sciences themselves. That is, wisdom does not simply judge according to the specifics of the specific ends of each discipline, but rather in terms of how these disciplines themselves and our practices within them align or fail to align with the good itself. Put another way, although in our assessments we might judge the processes and the products of student performance in their respective fields of investigation, using the criteria of those particular disciplines as our benchmarks, we can't do the same with respect to wisdom. For that would be to measure what's higher by what is lower. And as Plato tells us, wisdom is itself the true measure. It's the benchmark of all benchmarks and the standard of all standards. But then, if wisdom's pursuit cannot be understood as being akin to our most familiar, obvious ways of knowing, those ways that are the subject of all our formative and summative assessments in schools, how then does the precious pursuit of wisdom transpire? How can we coax it along among our students? And how can we pursue wisdom ourselves? Second, the pursuit of wisdom involves not knowing, but more like unknowing. In his excellent book, Philosophy is a Way of Life, Pierre Hadot points out that when we philosophize, like all those ancient interlocutors of Socrates, we enter into a state of confusion, perplexity, or aporia. In philosophic discussion, we don't come to know anything, only akin to Socrates that we do not know what we thought we knew. So at the end of philosophic discussions, the interlocutor, quote, he hasn't learned anything. In fact, he no longer even knows anything, unquote. In such a state, positive measurements of knowledge and skills, as well as the assessor's concern with finding ways of improving the cognitive achievements of his or her students, are certainly problematic. And yet, as Hadot points out, quote, throughout the duration of this discussion, he, the student, has experienced what true activity of the mind is, unquote. Third, wisdom's pursuit is a kind of spirit. It's not a product, it's not a process. As teachers, we can and do assess for the kinds of knowing that the Greek called dianoia. Essentially those forms of cognition enumerated in Bloom's taxonomy. But we cannot likewise assess for the sort of cognition that's at the heart of wisdom seeking, which the Greeks called by the name noesis. As the main heart and mind activity of philosophy, noesis is a certain spirit of inquiry. You can't really tell simply from outward manifestations in, say, a process well executed or in a product well made. This will bamboozle us as assessors, right? The spirit of wisdom seeking distinguishes it from what is not wisdom seeking rather than its outward form. The classic illustration of this problem calls us back to the time of ancient Greece and concerns how the sophist and the philosopher could be so easily mixed up, right? Or mistaken for one another. So, crap assessment and such things is what got Socrates killed, really. See, both the sophist and the philosopher use the same kinds of speech. Both speak about the same topics, both engage in the same sorts of processes and products. So it was commonplace to mistake the philosopher's doppelganger, the sophist, for a genuine lover of wisdom, the philosophos, right? Precisely because the philosopher's dialectic, or in form at least, is identical with the sophist's heuristic. But the sophist and the philosopher are entirely opposite characters, ladies and gentlemen. For the philosopher is motivated and acts from a genuine spirit of loving wisdom, whereas the sophist does not, supposing he's already wise. The spiritual quality of wisdom seeking, therefore, creates big problems for us as teachers, all hot to assess our students. The drive towards assessment in schools and universities seems pretty much inescapable. Nothing matters in the machinery of educational institutions unless it can be made subject to rigorous assessment or assigned a grade. But as we've seen, noetic cognition and contemplative practice in the pursuit of wisdom necessarily escape those objective lists in the school curricula because it's a spirit rather than simply a demonstrable form. The presence of noesis can't be accounted for as just one more bullet in a catalog of dianoetic outcomes or simply another level in Bloom's taxonomic pyramid. Fourth, not a critical assessor's eye, but a loving gaze is required. Our classroom assessments are good for many things, but they cultivate the wrong kind of seeing for wisdom's pursuit. Certainly, our assessor's gaze is a kind of seeing. It judges the right from the wrong, the good from the bad, the beautiful from the ugly, and the straight from the crooked, the wheat from the chaff. Summatively, it's a kind of seeing that ranks good, better, and best, as well as bad, worse, and worst. Formatively, it's a seeing that's concerned with rendering the worse better, and the better best. Assessment involves a kind of seeing that focuses upon measuring and manipulating manyness and change, qualities, attributes, details, and appearances. But this kind of objective seeing is quite the opposite to the theoretic contemplative gaze, which knows not by throwing an object over against oneself, the root meaning of object knowing, in fact, but by reducing the distance between the knower and the known to zero, knowing by loving. Recall a time, this is my daughter when she was little, recall a time when you've been with your own small children at the park, perhaps playing at the pool, or while they were playing. Do you remember them calling to you, Dad, Mom, look at me, watch me? And calling out for you, they don't want you to evaluate them. Indeed, it's perhaps because children become all too familiar with the assessor's objective gaze that later in life they most certainly do not cry out, look at me any longer, but rather wish the teacher or parent would stop looking at them, knowing that his or her gaze is a critical rather than an accepting one. Children are not looking for a grade or a score when they call out for you to watch them. They don't want your feedback about how they could, for instance, climb the monkey bars better, or learn to pile the mud more neatly next to the puddle in the yard. Children do not want to be evaluated, they simply want to be seen. This is the loving, contemplative gaze of theoria. And as grown-ups, in our hearts, I think this is what we deeply crave as well. But again, it's quite opposite to the assessor's critical gaze. Fifth, wisdom seeking looks like idiocy using the assessor's gaze. So, in Zen practice, the loving theoretic gaze is known as beginner's mind or Shoshin. However, one who gazes so lovingly with Shoshin is necessarily judged by all ordinary measures as imbecilic. Stories of ridiculous philosophers abound throughout world literature, from Thales' famed incident of falling into the well, to Thomas Aquinas' nickname as the dumb ox, the great Taoist master Lao Tzu, therefore exclaimed in his Tao Te Ching, "My mind is that of a fool, how blank." More recently, the venerable Chan Master Hua similarly spoke of in his Dharma talks of a great wisdom which appears to be stupidity, even referring to himself using the epithet semblance of stupidity. This man here. Islamic scholar Idris Shah also wrote of the Sufi tradition in this manner, remarking, quote, "Because what narrow thinkers imagine to be wisdom is often seen by the Sufis to be folly, the Sufis, in contrast, sometimes call themselves the idiots." Moreover, Lao Tzu writes that the appearance of idiocy is not simply a problem of misconception localized in his own time period. It's rather how all who seek the way will always appear to a mainstream audience. Quote, "When the best student hears about the way, he practices it assiduously. When the average student hears about the way, it seems to him one moment there and gone the next. When the worst student hears about the way, he laughs out loud. If he didn't laugh, it would be unworthy of being the way." Unquote. Given the pervasive failure of summative assessment practices throughout history, right? That's what Lao Tzu says, throughout history. Ever to capture or to truly understand the nature of philosophic or contemplative practice, it's to be expected that genuine philosophizing, even when held up to our summative assessments today, will continue to appear idiotic. And arguably, that both students and teachers who genuinely embark upon philosophizing in the classroom will themselves continue to be sidelined and derided in schools. Maybe you've felt that way. I know I have. Sixth, contrary to our formative concerns with achievement as assessors, there can be no concern for progress if there is to be progress in wisdom. Just as summative assessments fail to hit their mark where wisdom's pursuit is made the focus of education, so too do all formative assessment practices falter. Put simply, ancient and medieval contemplative traditions warn against indulging our desires for self-improvement, personal development, attainment, achievement, or progress. Where formative assessment is concerned with rendering the worst better and the better best, contemplative practice is, by contrast, not so much about learning as it is about unlearning. As Zhuangzi writes, quote, "Not because of cunning or daring, not because he has learned, but because he has unlearned," unquote. Similarly, Lao Tzu tells us, quote, "In the pursuit of learning, one knows more every day. In the pursuit of the way, or the Tao, one does less every day," unquote. Thomas Merton. See up there? Yeah, there he is. Thomas Merton writes that contemplation can never be the object of calculated ambition. It's not something that we plan to obtain with our practical reason. Aligned with Merton's observations, John Maine similarly contends that in contemplation you don't demand results. You don't look for progress. Unquote. Progress in the pursuit of wisdom is, in fact, impeded by the concern for progress. Seeking to attain for oneself what one has yet to attain is contrary to philosophic catabasis, or what Plato has called, or has Socrates called, the art, or dying to the self, or the art of dying, right? As Heraclitus points out, without catabasis, without going down, right, no corresponding anhirasis, or going up, is possible. For in fact, the two are one and the same. Hence, we ought never to look at contemplative wisdom-seeking practices as technicians in search of a perfecting technique, or as a means towards our improvement. Zen Master Dogen, his most basic teaching in the Soto school is that satori, or enlightenment, is not the goal of training. Zazen is not a means to anything. In essence, Dogen insists that there is no difference between practice and enlightenment, because all human beings are already endowed with Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha. There is no use function that brings this nature about. There's no attainment. To practice the way, he says, single-heartedly is in itself enlightenment. There is no gap between practice and enlightenment, or zazen, in daily life. Unquote.
We're down to 1 minute.
Oh my gosh, really? Can I finish? I've just got like this little bit and that little bit. Is that good? Okay, sorry about that. Whereas in our formative classroom assessment practices associated with dynamic cognition, we naturally offer our students feedback designed to encourage and to coax them towards improvement in their noetic practices, we would be mistaken to do so in their noetic practices. Sorry, threw off my groove. Sorry. As John Main writes, we don't need to be encouraged in the progress we are making. That would be altogether too self-conscious an approach. It's far too egotistical. Shunryu Suzuki similarly advises, in Shoshan, there is no thought, I have attained something. All self-centered thoughts limit our vast mind. When we have no thought of achievement, then we can really learn something. I guess I can, just let me do these last 2 slides. 7th, there's not only no attainment you can assess, there's no one who does the attaining. Perhaps the greatest problem with supposing that even the best formative or summative assessment practices could ever be used to evaluate student progress in noetic cognition is that, strictly speaking, noesis only arises to the extent that the self is allowed to disappear. To the extent that it is realized and embodied in each person's life, there is indeed no one who might receive either accolades or censure for attaining or failing to attain to a knowledge of what is. Philosophy in this regard demands the cultivation of absolute humility and leaving behind all self-regard in order to know the totality. Josef Pieper has written poignantly about this lack of self-regard as the distinguishing characteristic of a philosopher or a lover of wisdom. The true philosopher, thoroughly oblivious to his own importance and totally disregarding all pretentiousness, approaches his unfathomable object, namely wisdom, unselfishly and with an open mind. The contemplative, or the contemplation of this object in turn transports the subject beyond mere self-centered satisfaction and releases him from fixation on selfish needs, no matter how intellectual or sublime. Okay, that's it. Sorry. I didn't mean to go over time. I apologize. So.
All right, thank you.
All right. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right, so we do have time for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Sean. I obviously agree with your premise that assessment is not tracking necessarily the most valuable things in education or necessarily anything at all. I'm always a little suspicious about claims of something like pure wisdom that is separate from even knowledge that we can assess. It tends to sort of veer into the mystical, which leaves me feeling a little dissatisfied. So I wonder, for one thing, how you arrive at the designation of, say, these particular traditions as wisdom in distinction with the other things which are not wisdom. Isn't that already an assessment of wisdom? And then even within the traditions, it's clear that there's assessment going on. For example, you had a couple pictures of labels like Zen master. In virtue of what does a Zen person become a master if there's no assessment in Zen? In the monotheistic mystical traditions, sometimes humans abdicate judgment of others, but they still believe that God is judging, so there's still some assessment going on there. So I just wonder if you can speak to, first of all, the distinction between sort of pure wisdom and all the other stuff, and what about the assessment within wisdom traditions?
Yeah, well, a good example of the assessment within wisdom traditions is, right, you say, right, and you've got the Rinzai Zen, right, where they do the koans, right, the little riddles, yeah, riddles, right. So, what is this on one hand clapping? Does a dog have cute Buddha nature and stuff like that? And then there's, there's a kind of a back and forth between the Zen master and the monk, whatever, right? So it looks like, this is a kind of assessment. It's the Roshi doing the assessing and his or her student being assessed. But it's quite different from the classroom teachers, summative and formative assessments, where the classroom teacher assesses his or her students based upon the achievement of demonstrated learning goals. A koan in one of these riddles says, Iti Suzuki, for instance, is not a logical proposition, but the expression of a certain mental state resulting from the Zen discipline. So, and like Merton too, right? He remarks, although koans in some sense have a solution, this solution is not an answer, right? It's in fact a solution that can only be known by being lived, and that's what philosophy is. It's a way of life. So the wisdom's pursuit is a way of life, right? The true koan meditation is one in which the disciple comes to be so identified with the koan that he experiences his whole self as a riddle without an answer. So this is, the Roshi's assessment is really a non-assessment, is what I'm trying to say. You say it's an assessment, but it's really a non-assessment. That is, it neither measures nor scaffolds student learning. Rather, it is aimed at unlearning. It doesn't serve to build up an edifice of knowledge, but tears down all such edifices and presumptions to know. The Roshi looks for evidence that the student in his or her contemplative practice has experienced the faltering of dianoetics. All these things that we assess, she's looking for the faltering of that. That he or she has come to see there is no answer to attain, right? Just as there is no one to attain such an answer. The Roshi's assessment, the thing that you're speaking of, in other words, violates every tenet of emerging theories about valid assessment, which is that we must only measure what a student knows and never what he or she does not know. But how can the student be assessed on what he or she knows when there is no he or she who might really know, just as there's nothing to be known, right? That, in a short way, that is a response to that question, I would say.
Sorry, can I just follow up for a second? So thank you, and I think I understand that conceptually, but my question is still, you've determined that this is missing in contemporary education.
Yeah.
On what grounds are you determining that that kind of wisdom is more worthwhile than what is going on in contemporary education? And if it is more worthwhile or equally worthwhile, how do you propose to integrate it?
Oh, yeah. Well, so that's kind of a similar question, right, that you were asking the other fella too, as a group. I mean, I don't have like a big idea about how to make people do this. Honestly, I don't think that you can set up education, like a system of education that promotes this. Really, I think it's because it's a spirit. It has to come from you, the teacher. Right? It has to be something that you yourself live, that you embody, that you seek out, and you live that with your students, and you bring that spirit into your classroom every day. I could like have a course, philosophy of education 101 or whatever, right? I have done that at Ambrose, and don't do that, because people tend to not really necessarily. I find that about half the Bachelor of Education students who you expose to the idea of wisdom's pursuit, and not just as like some kind of like object where you're just reading books and you're answering questions and you're like mastering a text, but actually doing, like, what does that mean to have that love of wisdom in your heart and motivating your mind and your spirit? half of them seem to be enthused or interested. The other half want to kill you. And if you're a sessional student or teacher like myself, it's kind of dangerous. So I don't know, I don't think that people have really thought about what wisdom is. Getting back to your first question, right? Like, what's wisdom? And yeah, I think I'm not scared off by the idea that there's something mystical about wisdom, because I'm following, I was talking to you earlier before we started, right? I'm following the ancient Greek traditions, I'm following the ancient mystical traditions and philosophic traditions, where wisdom, says Pythagoras, what is wisdom? Wisdom is the possession of a god, of the god, right? So, it's not a human thing. And in as much as it's a human thing, it's not a mortal thing. So if it's a human thing, it has to be something that transcends the mortal nature of humans. So that's why Aristotle calls philosophy the art of immortalizing, right? Athanatos, right? It's athanatizing. That's the word he uses, right? In the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, immortalize, right? It's like command that we all do this. So what the heck is that? What the heck does that mean? It is a perplexity. I don't know, in other words, I don't know how to go about doing that. That's why I left teaching post-secondary and I'm back teaching high school, because I find that in high school, I can be with students and they're young and they still have questions. And people in bachelor education programs, about half of them do, sort of, and about half of them definitely do not. They're like, what was his name, Dorian?
Dorian.
Was saying, people just want the easy money, they want the instrumentality of it, they want the, they want the toolbox, that's all they want out of this. Right? They don't want the big questions, and they're not interested. And if you expose them to the big questions, they get really infuriated. Right?
Okay, we have another question.
Well, I'm quite sympathetic to your emphasis upon wisdom and contemplation and the love of wisdom as a sort of pursuit of life. It's a problem, though, and maybe this is kind of following up on your question and your answer. If you think of that in the context of today, what it means to be a professor or a teacher today,
Yes.
doesn't that really lead to a kind of pessimism about what you can actually achieve in the context of, let's say, a teacher education program or a graduate program or school system or whatever?
Yeah.
That actually, because I think you're right, we have got away from the idea that wisdom is important as something other than just knowing in an instrumental way.
Yeah.
So where do we go with this?
I know! I'm with you. Like, one of the guys that I used to get the students to read was Isocrates, right? The old sophist dude. And, really, he was annoyed with philosophers because he says, this is pessimism, right? This is like, what you guys are doing, it's like when Socrates was accused in the Plato's Meno of being a stingray, paralyzing you for action. Like, as a philosopher, you're asking questions that put a brake on getting her done, that put a brake on achieving, that put a brake on all these. So it's like a pessimism. It stifles activity. And Isocrates was one of these guys saying, if we follow these idiots, we're all done. Like, what we need is some new way of educating the young of Athens that makes us more able to act. Whereas these philosophers, what do? They stifle action. Pessimism, right? They just create inaction. They make us unable to act. That's been a timeless complaint about philosophy.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that what do we as philosophers do if we believe some of this stuff in the context of educating people? Aren't we likely to end up rather pessimistic? Personally, just personally, somebody said in another session yesterday about the importance of hope.
Yes.
I sort of always try to hold on to that and try to say to my students how important hope is. But given what you've said, it seems to me rather difficult to actually grasp onto it.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I have was an obstructionist in the last session, and now I want to be a facilitator. So, taking your exchange. So maybe I'm thinking about how would you do this in a school?
Yeah.
And we have different streams. We have the science stream, and we have the IT stream, whatever else. Why not a wisdom stream? And now parents would have to sign off on a pre-consent form, right? Because this is moving towards mysticism, so they have to sign off. But when they signed off, you could have 5 or 10 or 15 students that would take much of the same curriculum as everybody else.
Yeah.
But there'd be the first hour in the morning or something, and there would be yoga exercises or meditation opportunities. And anyway, so I was thinking about a stream in a school. And they'd have their own little corner in the school, and then they would join for phys ed and check about Voc and that sort of stuff in the regular way. And they'd join the basketball team after school.
You know what I've done? I'm a high school teacher. And, like, I've done some of that, but I get the kids doing journals, like, as a kind of I do it like a Thoreau thing, right? Thoreau's Walden. I get them, we read selections out of Thoreau's journals from Walden, right? We don't worry about reading the whole thing, because who needs to read the whole thing? You just read little bits, take your time through it, and then we do exercises and experiments, right? And the kids journal how that went. I give them all kinds of prompts to try, and it can be really good. It can be really, and the kids, it's about opening them and allowing them to wonder and to question, like, and they're putting aside, like, what's practical, about all this stuff. Maybe there's nothing really practical about this, but I'm genuinely inquiring to know. I'm putting aside all these other things that catch my attention that my parents want me to know and that I'm expected. Here I am in Cecile's class, and we're just open to be able to try these things. I think it's totally doable. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we're wrapping up now.
Okay.